Good afternoon, all y'all out there in YouTube land. I am back with another video. I'm here for 4th of July, so happy 4th of July to everyone. I wanted to make a video today to just show a few things and celebrate our country, to celebrate the founding of our country, the birth of our country, if you will. And I've got a few items I'm going to show you. One really old, one kind of old, and a couple that are newer. But I think are interesting and important. As you know from the previous videos, I am a law enforcement officer, career law enforcement officer, and I'm also an attorney. I went through law school at night. I talked about that some in one of my earlier videos. At that point, I was still a student, but I have since graduated and passed the bar. So anything to do with law, and especially constitutional law, things that reach back to our founding, are really important to me. And I've spent a lot of time with it. I can remember as a child going to Washington, D.C. and going in the rotunda there at the archives and seeing the display of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and just being amazed that those documents written so long ago can still have power today to govern our lives and still reflect some important values that we hold as Americans. Now, we haven't always lived up to those. You just heard the cats. I have them put away for the video. But we haven't always held up to those ideals, but we try. And I think our country is very unique in its dedication to personal and individual freedoms. So I just wanted to take a minute and show you a few things in my collection that do refer back to that. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the oldest thing I'm going to show you today, and this is and the front cover is already loose, so that's the condition I got it in. And this is a book of Massachusetts law, and I'm going to go ahead, let's put this to the side so we can see what's inside. There is a book plate from a Samuel Barstow and some writing I haven't quite figured out yet, so I'm not quite sure what that is. But this particular volume, this is Massachusetts law. So why would I bring that up today? Well, Massachusetts, particularly Boston, was one of the centers of what became the American Revolution. You had John Adams, who later became president. He was one of the drafters of the Declaration. And his cousin Sam Adams, who most people today think of the beer when they hear him, but he was his cousin. They were out of Boston. A lot of this happened in Boston. So the fact that this is Massachusetts law is pretty cool. The other thing here is that this volume is the first volume of what I'm sure was a multi-volume set. State laws are usually pretty voluminous. So here in Georgia, I think our current state statutes are somewhere in the order of 30 volumes. But the first one usually lays out the Constitution and some other things. This particular version, published in 1807, and it covers the Massachusetts laws between November 28th of 1780 and February 28th of 1807. Our country was still very, very young. This is a very early edition of Massachusetts laws. Our Constitution, as we know it, wasn't ratified until 1787. So, this is only, what, 20, 30 years from the actual founding of our current constitutional system, and not too far off of the mark from the signing of the Declaration of Independence that happened in 1776, less than 30 years. So, it's an early edition. Another interesting thing is it does contain a copy, or a printing, I should say, of the Constitution of the United States. Again, this is a very early version of the Constitution. We've had a number of amendments since then. But when this was printed, and it's really, if you look at it, you can see the hand-laid paper. It's hard to tell in the video, but the way the characters are printed in the paper, it's clear this was done on a hand-pressed printing press. So just the production technique is pretty fascinating. But content-wise, this copy of the Constitution contains what would become the Bill of Rights, with a couple of extra amendments that weren't ratified, and then what was to become the 11th Amendment within about a year or so. I can't remember off the top of my head when the 11th Amendment was ratified, but it was shortly after this would have been printed in 1807. So historically, this is an important volume because it is a volume of very early law from Massachusetts, from really the kind of the cradle of where the Revolution came from. Not very long after the Revolution had occurred. So kind of a neat artifact, a neat thing to show and to look back at today as we celebrate the Declaration of Independence. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute too. So the second thing I want to show you, not nearly as old. This is old, but not hundreds of years old. This other book, you know, it's with its publication date, it's what, 212 years old. No, this isn't. This is about 50 years old or so. It's got this really lovely leather binding. This actually is leather. When I first picked it up, I just picked it up because I thought it was neat and I liked the content. But come to find out, it is actually leather. And inside, by the way, I didn't really look at the title. It's called The Founders of Freedom. And it talks about all the signers of the Declaration of Independence and what happened to them, their lives, and how they unfolded. So there's this little pamphlet inside from Mission Leather, who turns out is the binding provider, and it talks about you know, the leather in your product. And in the back there's a notation, an inscription for Raymond Parks, December 25th, 1965. So this must have been a Christmas gift for Mr. Parks, wherever you are, in 1965. So pretty cool book. And then the contents itself, it's got some really nice color plates, some nice pen and ink illustrations, and it goes into great detail. Some things about you know, how we adopted the Declaration of Independence. By the way, there's a really good video on YouTube. It's put out by the History Channel, documentary on the Declaration of Independence and how it was created and what happened to it since. But this has a lot of that. So, okay, here we go. Here's talks about John Adams. I was just talking about John Adams. So there's the first portion of the book. So cool book, really neat binding. You know, approximately 50 years old, so 50 and 52, 53 years old, but very nice. So that's my old, but not really old. And then more modern, I've had this probably 8 or 9 years. This is a Barnes & Noble edition of the Constitution of the United States, and it's also got some of our other founding documents in it. Leather-bound edition. I think these are still in print at Barnes & Noble. Nice end papers with the painting dealing with the signing of the Declaration, and it's got, you know, all kinds of important American documents in it. So nothing here particularly valuable. I like the way it looks, and I love the content. And it's and I have taken it down, and when I've needed to read something out of the Constitution, this is one of the ones I go to. And then the final thing I want to show you is a modern book, and it's unique. It's just a cool book. There's nothing really valuable here other than I just like it. And it's called The Declaration of Independence, A Museum in the Box. A Museum in a Book, by a fellow by the name of Rod Gregg. So what this book is it details all the history of the Declaration, and along the way, it's got all these facsimile artifacts that you can look at, hence the Museum in a Book portion. It's got some really cool things. You know, these little sleeves here. There's some sort of royal proclamation. I haven't looked at exactly what all of that is. It's kind of neat. This is what is this? Reproduction of, you know, some money printed in the colonies, I suppose. Yeah, I can get it put back. One of the more interesting things, a couple of interesting things. So there is a reproduction of the pamphlet common sense, which is one of the things that really kind of sparked and led towards the revolution, that really talked about why the colonies should declare their independence from Great Britain. And then a couple of pages over, and I've already taken it out so I don't have to bother unfolding it, is a facsimile, a reproduction of the draft for the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And Thomas Jefferson was part of a committee of, I believe it was 5, included John Adams and a couple of other folks I can't remember right this second. And so they drafted the Declaration. Now the purpose of the Declaration was to break from England, to declare the colonies independence from England, and they felt they needed to explain why they were doing that. So that was the purpose of the document. Now, we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, but that's a little bit of a misnomer, because the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, they were convened in Philadelphia, they actually approved this resolution to separate from England on July 2nd. So July 2nd was when the decision was made. Now, they came back with this draft, and then Congress edited the draft. Some of the committee edited the draft to come up with the final document. So the final document was, its form was approved on July 4th, but it still was not yet signed. So they hand wrote a really nice version of it for signature. By this point, they already sent out copies of the text to be printed and distributed to the states. So that did happen on or about the 4th. But they didn't come back and actually sign that final document until a month later, until August 4th of 1776. So we celebrate July 4th, but there's a little bit more to that timeline than that. One of the final things in this book that I've already taken out, but I had to set it aside because it's huge. It includes a life-size replica. I'm gonna have to stand up. A life-size replica of the Declaration of Independence. Isn't that cool? Very well done, very well printed with the signatures. Now, the real Declaration of Independence in the archives is barely readable anymore because of ravages of time. But this is a really cool document. And I'll kind of close with this. So I mentioned in that very first book I showed you, that date was 1807. Some of these founders were still alive. And in particular, I think of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So the thing about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams is they didn't always get along. They opposed each other in the presidential election of 1800 that actually resulted in a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison that really established kind of the authority of the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't want a history lesson in that today, but you know, they didn't always get along, so there was a lot there. But in the end, they did think a lot of each other. So in 1807, when that first book was printed, they would have both still been alive. They both, however, died on July 4th, but in 1826. So they both died on the same day. John Adams' reported last words were that Thomas Jefferson still survived. But in fact, Thomas Jefferson was in Virginia and breathed his last on the same day. So kind of an interesting note of history. But I'd like to close this last phrase of the Declaration. And for the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You got to understand, when they signed this document, they were committing treason, punishable by death. Today, in our current environment, it's hard to imagine congressmen pledging to each other their lives and their fortunes. This was a pivotal moment in history, and these people who signed this document really cared about freedom and cared about what happened to the American people to the point that they were willing to lay down everything that they had for it. So when you think about today, enjoy the parades, enjoy the cookouts, enjoy the fireworks, but remember the document and remember the men and what it cost them to give us the freedom that we have. I hope y'all have a happy 4th of July, and I thank you for joining me today. I'll do another one sometime soon. Thanks. Bye.